Well, greetings everyone, and welcome to God Save the King. I am your host, Tim Keyes, and I want to thank you for listening to God Save the King or watching it. It is available on video on certain platforms, but you're listening to it probably on the Truth Be Told radio network, where you can hear God Save the King every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern Time. And while on one hand, God Save the King is my radio show, God Save the King is actually the name of my ministry and the name of my research project. This is an ongoing, over 30-year research project into what the nativity really would have looked like. So we engage definitely in biblical research. That is the primary source here. We are biblically orthodox. So we look at the biblical record about the nativity, but of course we also dive into historical records and scientific research as well. And this is all devoted to deconstructing the traditional nativity story, which is Christian mythology, and then reconstructing the nativity and telling the story the way it really would have happened, because telling the story is critical, because this is a huge story. I had mentioned in some earlier episodes that this is in a way, listen to my words carefully, this is mythology, but I don't mean mythology in the sense that it's a false story. Okay. I don't mean that at all. I mean mythology in the sense that mythology is transcendent. Mythological stories, whether they're Greek myth, Roman myth, or biblical truth, okay, they are mythological in the sense that they are transcendent and eternal stories. They deliver transcendent ideas and eternal concepts. Okay. Now, mythology, Greek mythology or Roman mythology or whatever, that is not inspired by God. I'm not saying that for 1 second. It is not scripture. It is not inspired by God. But these are stories that in many ways are actually ingrained in human nature and that we recognize almost without thinking about it. So the Bible is the pinnacle. There you go, right? The Bible is the pinnacle of this kind of story because it is the transcendent eternal story, unquestionably. But a big part of this transcendent eternal story is when Jesus of Nazareth came into the world and began his earthly ministry. I mean, when he didn't necessarily begin his earthly ministry as a baby, but then again, yeah, he did in a way, right? We think about his earthly ministry, we think of him as an adult of about 30 years of age. But I mean, this is what's the word I'm searching for here? This is the incarnation, right? This is the incarnation of the Son of God into the world, right? So the nativity is a very, very, very important story. So truth matters. Truth matters, very simply. So I'm really sorry to burst people's bubble, but when you're looking at the traditional nativity story, that is Christian mythology, and that is not what the birth of Jesus Christ would have looked like. So God Save the King is my ongoing 30-year plus biblical research project into deconstructing the traditional nativity story and reconstructing the accurate, real, biblical, historical, and scientific nativity story as it really would have looked. So if you appreciate content like this, would you please make sure to like and follow and subscribe to my posts and videos, both on the Truth Be Told radio network sites and also on the God Save the King sites. So that means our home websites plus our social media, Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, Twitter, Rumble, stuff like that. So my home website, www.godsavetheking.org, and the Truth Be Told radio network, www.truthbetoldnetwork.org. Okay. Now remember, time to make this statement again. Okay, there are some bullet points about the nativity that remain the same. Okay. Mary and Joseph definitely traveled from Nazareth to Bethlehem. Yes, there were shepherds that found a baby in a manger. Yes, the young child Jesus and his parents were visited by wise men from the east. And yes, Joseph and Mary fled to Egypt to avoid Herod's wrath. And yes, Herod murdered all the male children in and around Bethlehem. But Joseph and Mary's journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem was not necessarily all that hazardous, right? And they probably didn't travel alone. That's not likely that that's how that happened. There's no donkey mentioned in the biblical record, and the likelihood that Mary rode a donkey, it's hard to say, 50-50. I actually believe that Mary and Joseph traveled to Bethlehem much earlier in her pregnancy than the traditional nativity story tends to indicate. So that means she actually could have ridden on a donkey, whereas according to the traditional nativity story, she rode a donkey while not only pregnant, but frankly in labor. So that's a little bit on the ridiculous side. But I happen to think that they actually traveled to Bethlehem when Mary was no more than about 4 months pregnant. So given that understanding, it is possible she could have ridden the donkey. But then again, it's also more than likely that she just walked or that she rode in a cart. Those are every bit as likely a possibility as riding a donkey. But there's no donkey mentioned in the biblical record. And that goes right to the heart of the matter, which is, are we reading the biblical record carefully, or are we giving into the curse of familiarity? Because oftentimes we have to rescue truth from familiarity. There's also no innkeeper mentioned in the Bible, right? Now, if there were an innkeeper would be a reasonable projection or reasonable conjecture, right? But there actually is no inn mentioned either. We now know that the better translation of the Greek word kataluma should be guest room. There was no room in the guest room where Joseph and Mary were staying. Also, we know he was laid in a manger, but according to Judean architecture, you don't find a manger in a stable. You find a manger in the living room of a Judean home. I know that sounds odd. We'll talk about that in more detail in a different episode. And then, of course, although the young child was visited by wise men, there weren't only 3 of them, and they weren't kings, and they didn't arrive on the night of Jesus' birth, but over 1 year later. And that's where we're going to take up today or tonight with where we left off last time, because we have been starting to talk about what I refer to as the Parthian Chronicle. I divide God Save the King into 3 major sections. Number 1 is the Judean Chronicle. So that is Joseph and Mary, their extended family, and then also the Judean governmental figures at that time, which is, it's not really the Hasmoneans anymore. It's Herod as an extension of the Hasmoneans, but we definitely want to lay the groundwork talking about the Hasmonean, the house of Hasmon, the Maccabees. That's critical in our story. It's critical to understanding who Herod is and how he figures into the story. But that's the Judean Chronicle. Then you have the Parthian Chronicle. The Parthian Chronicle is everything that happened to the east. The wise men, the magi, the Parthian Empire, which at this point in time is an enemy of the Roman Empire, which is to the west. And then, of course, that's the third chronicle, which is the Roman Chronicle. I actually include Herod as part of the Roman Chronicle because he was a Roman client king. But then we also understand the Roman Chronicle is, we factor in Julius and Augustus Caesar, Mark Antony, Cleopatra, all of the players on the Roman side of the story. But we are squarely in the Parthian Chronicle right now, which is funny because I didn't know this. When I originally grabbed onto those labels, Judean, Parthian, and Roman Chronicle, I was unaware that, because this was years ago, this was many years ago that I grabbed onto those labels. I was unaware of the fact that ancient Mesopotamian literature is called chronicles. It's so, which isn't too big of a shock. Lots of historical literature are called chronicles, but ancient Mesopotamian literature in particular is often called a chronicle. So anyway, we've been talking about the Parthian Chronicle. We've been talking about the history of the Magi. We've been talking about biblical archaeoastronomy. And I pretty much just kind of want to take up where we left off last time, because last time we talked extensively about the Assyrian Empire. Then the Assyrian Empire was the empire that dominated Upper Mesopotamia from like the 14th century BC until the late 7th century BC, when they were conquered by the Babylonians. So really what we're going to get into tonight is we're going to start talking about the Babylonian and to a certain degree the Persian period and who the Magi were in the Babylonian Empire and who the Magi were in the Persian Empire, with a specific emphasis, because what we've been going after is the background is this. We have essentially established that there existed in Mesopotamia a class of highly educated celestial observers that played a dual political and religious role in Mesopotamian culture, going back probably at least as far as 3000 BC. Wow, 3000 BC. And then if we fast forward in time, we get to the middle of the second millennium BC, not second century, second millennium BC. So roughly 1600 BC. We've already spoken about the Venus tablet of Ammisaduqa, which we call it that because it was recorded during the reign of Babylonian king Ammisaduqa. And the Venus tablet of Ammisaduqa is a cuneiform clay tablet that catalogs the heliacal risings of the planet Venus. So that helps us understand a lot of things about the Magi, that they were obsessed with the heliacal risings of stars and planets, and they recorded this meticulously. So the heliacal rising of a planet would be something that would get their attention. So when the Magi show up at the court of Herod the Great in Matthew 2, and they say, "We have seen his star in the east, En te Anatole, we have seen his star in the rising," that is what they are referring to. Contextually, it is very clear that is what they're referring to. They are not referring to the generic direction east. They are referring to a star in its heliacal rising, or in this case, a planet in its heliacal rising, because that is what they do. You wouldn't tell a story about an astronomer, right? And then as part of the story, cite an astronomical or astrological reference and say, "Oh, but yeah, that's not really what this is about," right? I mean, pick your metaphor. I mean, if you were, make it a sports metaphor and pick a sport. Let's pick baseball. So if a famous baseball player shows up and we're having a conversation and we start talking about, "Yeah, man, he hung that curve out over the plate." Okay, well, that's baseball terminology. Okay, we're not going to assume that we're talking about something different, right? So if the context is astronomers and astrologers and you talk about something in the rising, right, and these men are obsessed with the heliacal risings of stars and planets, then come on, guys, that's what we're talking about, right? I mean, I've read articles that try to say that the Magi weren't even astronomers, which is just ridiculous. Anyway, so like I've said, we've established the fact that in ancient Mesopotamia, possibly as back as 3000 years BC or more, there was a distinguished class of highly educated astronomical observers that played a dual religious and political role in their culture. Okay, and now we've got this record in 1600 BC, the Venus tablet of Ammisaduqa, and then we can also fast forward. We did this a couple of shows ago, where we talked about a particular clay tablet. I forget the label off the top of my head, but it is a clay tablet that references one of the men who is in the royal entourage in Jeremiah 39, I think it is, which is the second invasion or second conquest of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. And we're going to talk about that here in just a second. But what's amazing about that is this is another cuneiform clay tablet. And because it is an independent record of one of the officials that was in the middle gate during the second conquest of Jerusalem, that verifies Jeremiah 39. And in Jeremiah 39, we also read about the chief of the Magi. And this appears to be about the time. This appears to be about the time that the label Magi started to be used to refer to this classification of celestial observer. It also appears to go back to the Magians, okay, who were one tribe among the Medes, who are referred to by Herodotus. The historian Herodotus mentions the Magians, as one tribe among the Medes. And then what appears to have happened, we're not precisely sure, but this is how history how history works, is we go with the best information we have, and then we have to try to fill in the blanks, so to speak, but we don't want to fill in the blanks with speculation. We want to fill in the blanks trying to follow where the evidence leads us. So we have the suggestion that the name Magian came from one tribe among the Medes. That makes sense. There's no reason to really reject that. Now, if we get additional information, additional evidence that tells us otherwise, then we'll rethink it. But for the moment, that appears to make sense. And then from the records that we do have that start to refer to this classification of celestial observer as the Magi, okay, well, this appears to be during the Babylonian and then the Persian period is when this appears to have happened. So let's take up where we left off here. This is the historical background of the Magi, right? So we mentioned briefly the Battle of Carchemish last time. So after defeating the Egyptians and the Assyrians at the Battle of Carchemish and learning of his father's death, Nebuchadnezzar, right? There's the biblical name we all know. Nebuchadnezzar returned to Babylon to claim his throne and to rule his domain. But on the way home, he decided to take a little bit of a detour and just by the way, let's conquer Jerusalem, because there's this priceless golden temple that he can take as a trophy. So in August of 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to Jerusalem for the first time. This is the first siege of Jerusalem, and he took about 10,000 Jewish royalty and nobility and other influential citizens hostage to ensure the loyalty of the vassal king Jehoiakim. Okay, so the first wave of hostages included Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Okay, now we tend to say Daniel and then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but this is their Hebrew names: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Okay, so and this starts a period that we refer to as, the Babylonian captivity, right? So now false prophets put Jehoiakim on an ego trip, frankly, right, to rebel against Nebuchadnezzar, claiming that God is on our side, right? Jeremiah, however, prophesied that this was the hand of God and that rebellion would bring the destruction of Jerusalem, right? But Jehoiakim listened to the false prophets and rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar, which brought the second siege, right? The second siege of Jerusalem in 597. I think I actually misspoke earlier. The second siege would have been in about 597 BCE. And an additional 10,000 citizens were deported, including Jehoiakim himself, and Ezekiel would have been taken in that captivity as well. And Jehoiachin's uncle Mattaniah was installed as the vassal king by Nebuchadnezzar, and his name was changed to Zedekiah. Now, Zedekiah repeated the pattern of rebellion, and Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to Jerusalem a third time. See, and I think I just realized that I misspoke earlier. This is the third siege of Jerusalem, not the second, okay? Laid siege to Jerusalem a third time between 588 and 586 BC, and this time the city was destroyed, the temple burned, right? And the bulk of the southern kingdom was taken captive. Now, quickly remember, the northern kingdom is already in captivity, okay? Over 100 years earlier is when the Assyrian Empire swooped in, destroyed the northern kingdom, and took the bulk of the entire kingdom into captivity, because that is what Assyrian foreign policy was you took your captives from one region and you moved them to another region of the empire, and then you took captives from a different region and you moved them into the region you just conquered, right? So what you do is you dilute and you dissimulate the local identity so they have less inclination to rebel, okay? So that had happened to the northern kingdom over 100 years earlier. So now the southern kingdom goes into captivity as well. There were more Judeans that remained behind. The northern kingdom was significantly depopulated. Just enormously depopulated. The southern kingdom was not entirely depopulated, but a big chunk of the people were taken captive, but a larger number were able to remain behind, but not in an established manner. They were very definitely nomadic at that point, right? So now, why is this important? Why is it important that we understand this? Well, this is because the Bible, in many ways, is a tale of two cities, right? One city is Jerusalem, the city of God. The other city is Babylon. And Babylon represents the city of man, right? Now, not necessarily the city of the devil or Satan, not necessarily, right? It's really the city of man, because the Bible is often widely misunderstood in this way. Yes, the Bible is a record of this struggle between the one true God and his arch nemesis, Satan, Lucifer, the devil. It is that. Don't get me wrong. It is that. But in many ways, it is less a record of that warfare than it is the warfare between God and humanity, right? Because humanity resists God and tries to replace him, frankly, with ourself, which is de facto satanic worship, but we're the problem. So Babylon scripturally is symbolic of the city of man, right? But now, directly for our purposes, the Babylonian captivity establishes a large Jewish population outside the promised land. That's what makes this so interesting. You go all the way back to the Abrahamic covenant, and you've got this promised land, right? And then, Abraham shows up, and then he has problems of his own and for the famine, and goes to Egypt, and then he comes back, and then he has, Isaac, and then Isaac has Jacob, and then Jacob has to take off, and then Jacob comes back to the land, and then Jacob, of course, has his sons. And, we know about Joseph gets sold into slavery and then goes through his whole ordeal in Egypt, where he winds up being prime minister. But then, lo and behold, due to another famine in the land, Jacob sends his other sons to Egypt to buy food, where they interact with Joseph, first unknowingly and then later knowingly. And then Joseph brings the entire family into Egypt, right? They go in as a family. Later on, they come out as a nation under Moses. They go back, they wander in the wilderness. Eventually, under Joshua, they enter into the promised land. Then you go through the period of the judges. And then finally, you get to the installation of the kings, right? The period of the kings, starting with Saul and then David and then Solomon. But then, after Solomon, you get the divided kingdom, and then eventually you get the Assyrian and Babylonian captivity. So it's this amazing, amazing story of this promise of God that you will inherit this land. But man, it is just this back and forth, up and down, sideways story about can they occupy the land? Can they hold on to it? God has promised it to them, and apparently he's given it to them, right? But can they hold on to it? And they have a real problem doing this. And so now you have the Assyrian and then the Babylonian captivities. And this establishes, like I said, a large Jewish population outside the Promised Land. Okay. Now, this is very interesting because even though they were forced to live in this quote unquote alien land, the Jews were really permitted to do quite a lot by the Babylonians. They were permitted to enter into business life. They were permitted to intermarry. And most consequentially, they were allowed to pursue their religion relatively unimpeded. Okay. So this is really interesting because this teaches the Jews how to survive in dispersion from their homeland, which is a lesson that is going to come back again and again and again, because it's going to introduce practices into their religion that help them survive outside the Promised Land, right? Now, the temple, of course, was this amazingly huge central feature to the practice of Judaism. So how could Judaism possibly survive without it, right? How could Judaism possibly survive, with a sizable portion of the Jewish population living outside the Promised Land, right? Well, frankly, Jeremiah addresses this, at least in part, when, he sends this epistle, right? He writes this letter, okay, during the captivity, that recognizes that you don't need to go to a central shrine to seek divine grace, right? And that it is actually, quite possible for a Jew who is hundreds of miles from the temple precincts to, be a pious Jew, right? So the fact that the Hebrews in exile enjoyed significant liberty and actually flourished in captivity is attested to by the fact that when Cyrus the Great, who is the Persian ruler, okay, one of the Persian rulers after the Babylonian period, he allowed the Jews to go home, but ironically, a majority of the Jews chose to remain in captivity. So there's really significant ramifications to why all this is true. But to get back more directly to God Save the King here, like we said, the Hebrews were allowed to enter into business. They were allowed to intermarry. And because we know the story of Daniel in particular, right, we know that you now have Jews serving in the royal court at Babylon. Because Daniel and his three friends, they fell into the same category as the wise men when Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, and it says that his wise men can't interpret the dream, and then he gets very upset, and he is going to start executing wise men if they can't interpret his dream. The word goes out, and it gets to Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah that they are apparently included in this same group, and that they're going to lose their heads as well if they don't come up with the interpretation to this dream, right? So that is extremely provocative to note that they fall into this same category. This is extremely provocative. And let's see if I can find it here. I didn't do my show prep quite good enough. I intended to get a particular graphic up here, and I forgot to do it. But, we'll just talk about it. I won't waste my time going and chasing it down. But the point here being is that, like I said, Daniel, Mishael, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah are in the same category, right? And then we know that they come through, right? They come through and they interpret the dream successfully for Nebuchadnezzar. And due to his demonstrated ability to interpret dreams, Daniel is appointed to be the chief of all of the wise men of Babylon. He is Rabmag. He is the head of the Magi. So now, because of, this is very critical, right? Because of the interconnection, the significant interconnection between the Jews in captivity and the Babylonian system itself, you've got to have some degree of cross-pollination here. Okay? And because of Daniel's demonstrated ability, okay, here you go, demonstrated ability to interpret dreams, that probably would have produced a couple of different reactions among the Babylonian Magi, right? One reaction would have been, of course, disdain. They would have went, oh my God, who is this foreigner? And he's not only in our court, but now you've put him in charge, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that very likely is a significant reason behind the episodes of both the fiery furnace and the lion's den, that was political retribution by other wise men going after Daniel and his friends, because frankly, they were foreigners, right? And they were foreigners who were who were experiencing God's favor and doing well in the Babylonian system. Isn't that interesting, right? But then this would enrage and make jealous the other Babylonian officials. Very, very, very provocative, right? So that is one highly probable reaction to Daniel and his friends serving in the Babylonian court. But then the other highly likely reaction is, whoa, wait a second. He nailed it. He interpreted that dream. How can we deny? How can we, as wise men who, pride ourselves on being objective and intellectual and academic and seekers of truth, right? How can we not acknowledge it for what it is, right? So they fall in line. They start to follow Daniel. They start to learn from Daniel, right? So what did Daniel know? What did he know, right? What did Daniel potentially know about the stars? No, we don't know that for sure, right? We don't know that for sure. And the only way we can figure it out, frankly, is by working backwards, right? We don't know exactly what it was he knew, but what we do know is that he would have worked within their system. He would have had access to their texts, right? He would have had access to the kind of clay tablets that we've been talking about so far, right? He may have even made some of them himself, right? Because remember when we talked about the planisphere is that one about 6-inch in diameter round clay tablet that's now at the British Museum in London, that we are figuring the one that was recovered from the library at Nineveh was probably written in about 700 BC, but we figure it's a copy of a tablet that would have been impressed about 3100 BC. But you think about that, and I'm pretty sure I've got it up on my website. So www.godsavetheking.org, and you can search for it. If not, I'll find it again and I'll repost it again because this is really cool. You can find it on YouTube if you just look up cuneiform clay tablet. Probably you'll find it, and it's an example of someone writing in cuneiform on a leather hard clay tablet, right? And it's a round tablet. It's really cool because who's ever holding it is holding it in the palm of their hand. And it's a round tablet, and they got this little triangular stylus, and they're going dunk, 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 and they're putting these impressions and writing in cuneiform in this tablet, right? And this is what would have happened. This is how they would have recorded. See, and when we talked about the planisphere, the the supposition here, the theory, the hypothesis is that these little round clay tablets like this that were big enough to hold in your hand, that these were the daily report, right? So if you were an observer, if you were a magi, and you would go outside at night, right? Either at sunset for the evening observation or at sunrise for the morning observation, or at any other time during the night when they would set a watch, when they would prescribe a recording, right? But you go out in the evening, you watch the sun go down, you're watching the stars come out, you're noting their locations, you've got an oil lamp or a candle there, you've got a leather hard clay tablet and a stylus, and you start going doink, 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 and you're recording what's where, when, how, etc. And that's what a lot of these clay tablets were about, is that they were the daily record. Okay. Now it appears from what we know now that these daily records would be kept for a week or a couple of weeks and presumably transcribed onto a different tablet to create, for example, like the Venus tablet of Amisaduqa. So now you have an entire catalog, right? And then they would use water and a rag or something equivalent to that, and they would frankly erase the tablet and re-wet it, and it would become leather hard again, and now you could use it again, right? So it was, pencil and paper, so to speak. But this appears to be what happened for the various observations. So it's really provocative to think that, like I said, not only would Daniel have had access to these, it's entirely possible Daniel did some of them himself, right? Made some of these recordings himself. And then once he understood that, okay, the Babylonians were, for example, were so big on the Heliacal risings, right? That he would have mentioned that, well, yeah, that's Heliacal rising, is significant, right? You should watch for that, right? They are significant. Or he would make mention of the fact that, well, in my tradition, in the tradition of my people, and the tradition of the one true God, each of the 12 major constellations is symbolic of one of the 12 tribes that my people come from, right? And he could have presented that in, because that we know that, right, from Joseph, right? When Joseph has the dream about the 11 constellations bowing down to him. This is very insightful, right? Because now here it is. See, it's dreams. See, it's dreams, for crying out loud. One of these days, I'll do probably a segment or two or three where all we talk about is dreams and how dreams occur in the Bible and what the Bible says about them, because it's right here in the story of the Magi. And the nativity story. I mean, in the nativity story itself, we know that God speaks to Joseph in a dream several times, and we know he speaks to the Magi in a dream, right? And then in the history of this kind of thing, Daniel was an interpreter of dreams and had dreams himself. And then you've got Joseph was a dreamer and interpreted dreams. I mean, this is a big darn deal biblically. I'm very fond of telling people that, the doctrine of dreams in the Bible, the fact that God speaks to people in dreams in the Bible is so plainly stated. It's right there in plain black and white. You've got God speaking to people in dreams in the Old Testament. You got God speaking to people in dreams in the New Testament. You've got him speaking to Jews. You've got him speaking to Gentiles. You've got him speaking to believers. You got him speaking to unbelievers. So this notion that God speaks to people in dreams is remarkably plain in Scripture. A plain reading of Scripture leads you to this understanding very readily, very easy. As a matter of fact, and this is why I said I like pointing this out, you can actually have a far greater doctrinal debate about other mainstream doctrines that are considered orthodox, that the church practices in all manner of, frankly, different ways. I mean, you want to start a debate, between different denominations, start a debate about whether water baptism is required or not. There's a debate, right? Start a debate about how is communion supposed to be handled, right? Is it every day? Is it once a week? Is it once a year? Is grape juice okay, or does it have to be wine? Right? All this stuff. Okay. You want to start a debate, you can start a debate. So the irony is that you could actually start a more substantial debate about that and have people really dig into scripture and say, well, we're basing our opinion on this, and actually have a far many more differing opinions than you can about what the Bible just very plainly says about dreams, that God speaks to people in dreams, right? But my point being is that back when Joseph had this dream, and my intention here is not to rabbit trail about dreams, but I guess we are. When Joseph has this dream, he has two dreams. He has the sheaves, of course, bowing down to him. And then he has another dream. And the second dream, it says the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bowed down to him, right? And then it says he tells the dream to his family. Now, a couple things here, a couple details. It is widely taught that Joseph screwed up here, that he messed up, that he was not supposed to tell his family his dream. I don't agree with that. Okay. I've been researching this subject for a long time, and I think that is our modern understanding of dreams and a very surface level reading of the text. I think culturally at that time, because this dream wasn't just for Joseph, this was a destiny dream for the entire family, not just Joseph, right? So therefore, culturally at that time, because dreams were considered to be a very powerful spiritual message, you told your dreams to your family. You made a point of it. Okay. It wasn't that you didn't do it. Of course you did it, right? Now there may have been, because it's widely considered that Joseph was arrogant, right? I'm not so sure that's the case. Now, there may have definitely been some youthful enthusiasm. Okay. Now that I can buy all day long, that Joseph was young, that he was inexperienced, he was very enthusiastic, and God just moved upon him in a very, very, very powerful way. So it's entirely possible that Joseph shot his mouth off. That I can believe all day long. But at the same time, I think in that culture, they were supposed to tell each other their dreams, and Joseph tells his dreams to his family. And take note, Joseph doesn't interpret the dream. His family interprets the dream all on their own. They knew what the dream meant. They didn't have to think about it. They didn't have to ask questions. They knew what the dream meant, right? And it goes on to say, and for this reason, Joseph's brothers hated him all the more. Okay, because they knew that the 11 constellations, Joseph himself being the 12th, bowing down to him, meant that they were going to bow down to him, that he was going to have the leadership of the family, right? And then even his father noted it, Jacob. Jacob comes to him and says, shall your mother and I and your brothers bow down to you? So his entire family, check this out, his entire family recognized the fact that there were 12 brothers and 12 major constellations, and that each constellation symbolically represented one each of the tribes. And then when you fast forward and you get to the book of Numbers and the Exodus and the wanderings in the wilderness, we also are aware that when Moses laid out the tribes on which side of the tabernacle they would reside on and pitch their tents, that the banners for each tribe was their constellation. We're aware of that. So the point being now we get back to Daniel, right? We've got these very subtle but significant references all through Scripture. And then when oh, by the way, and see, we'll do another whole show on this. When Jacob prophesies over his sons at the end of his life, there are some definite astronomical indicators in those prophecies. There's no question about it. Judah is a lion's whelp, and the scepter will not depart from Judah until a lawgiver comes. Until Shiloh comes and a lawgiver from between his feet. That is the constellation of Leo all day long, right? So what did these men know about astronomy that we apparently don't know today? And what did they pass down to Daniel? And that now Daniel is teaching the Babylonian Magi, right? What's he telling them? What's he teaching them? So once again, now, like I said, you've got these two extreme reactions to Daniel, those that want to kill him, right? But then those who want to follow him and learn from him, right? And as we are going to see through the remainder of this episode, and then as we move into the next episode where we're going to talk about the Persian period, right? Daniel survives into the Persian period. This is really, really, really significant that Daniel survives until the Persian period and serves briefly in the Persian court until his death, right? So there is significant influence because we know that the Magi played a huge role in the Persian Empire as well, that they carried on a lot of the traditions of the Babylonian courts were not stopped. You just had a different ruling class, so to speak, right? So what did Daniel know, and what did Daniel pass on to the Magi, right? Who then 600 years later show up at the court of Herod the Great and say, right, where is he who is born King of the Jews? They knew something. They knew something to look for. And also by this point, and this is a big part of what we're discussing, when Matthew uses the label Magi to describe them, he does it in such a way that whoever he was writing to would have understood, right? I mean, he's writing a gospel. He's writing a letter to people at that time, first century believers. First century believers are going to be the ones reading this thing. So that's his primary audience. So if he writes down, that about the time of the birth of the Messiah in the days of Caesar Augustus, there went out a decree. Oh, that's Luke, actually. The decree that the whole world should be taxed. But, in the days of Herod the king, there came wise men from the east. Magi, Magoi in Greek. Magi from the east, declaring, we have seen his star and have come to worship him. And he writes it so matter-of-factly, and he writes it in a way that whoever was reading it was supposed to understand it. So really pretty stunning, because it appears that it is logical to conclude. It appears logical to conclude that there was, for lack of a better way of putting it, there was secret knowledge passed on, right? That whatever was known by the 12 sons of Jacob, that each of the constellations represented a tribe, right? And then the fact that their tribal standard under Moses and Joshua, and that when they went into the land, their tribal standard was their celestial sign, right? The fact that, we'll do this another show on this too, the fact that there are synagogues in Egypt with the Mazzaroth laid out in the floor in ceramic tile, right? The Mazzaroth is depicted there with the Hebrew names and all that stuff. Very, very, very provocative. And it's really important that we understand this. Now, we are able to reverse engineer some of this because of what we have today, because of us, modern Christians, quote unquote, but also modern Jews for that matter, because we have the New Testament, because we have computers, because we have a far greater understanding of how astronomy works, we are able to reverse engineer some of this. as we have talked about at length, I absolutely believe that Revelation 12:1 is the sign of the birth, of the actual birth date of Christ, right? And that by interpreting that, right, by interpreting that and understanding, okay, that the woman is the constellation Virgo, that the crown is the royal tribe of Judah, and therefore Leo, the lion, right? And that the moon, she's clothed with the sun. The moon is in the middle of her body, or pardon me, clothed with the sun. The sun is in the middle of her body. The moon is under her feet. That's very interesting as well, right? Where is the moon positioned exactly, right? And on her head is a crown of 12 stars. And that could mean, you know, the naked eye observable stars of Leo plus 3 additional planets that point to a specific date, right? So it's not absolute, okay? There's probably still more that we can learn, but the evidence nonetheless does point us in that direction. So now when we have this kind of information, like I said, right? And especially when you look at the star names, when you look at the names of the stars, right? We talked about how the planet Jupiter in Hebrew is Tzedek, right? And then the planet Regulus. Now this is interesting because the planet the star, please forgive me, I keep mixing that up there and tripping over my own tongue. The planet Jupiter is called Tzedek in Hebrew, right? Then the star Regulus, which incidentally is between the feet of Leo the lion, hence the reference in Genesis 49:10, right? Regulus is between his feet. Regulus is known as the king star. Therefore, in Hebrew, it would be known as Melech, right? So when you put Regulus and Jupiter together, you get Melchizedek. Now, that's not a coincidence. There's no way that's a coincidence. And when you research who Melchizedek was in the Old Testament, that is confirmed to us in the New Covenant who Jesus is, that he is a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek, right? Then you have to wonder, what did Daniel know and what did Daniel tell the Magi, right? Did he tell them, we're not just looking for the king of Judea, we're looking for an eternal king, a king forever after the order of Melchizedek, and the sign that you will see. Now I'm just conjecturing this. Did he tell them that the sign that they would see would be the sign that would say Melchizedek in the royal constellation? So in other words, was he indicating that they would see the king star and the king planet in conjunction in Leo, and they would see it as part of a heliacal rising, because that was something that they were used to seeing? Did he tell them, when you see the heliacal rising of the sun, right? And Tzedek, the Hebrew word Tzedek, Jupiter, okay, Mulbabar in Babylonian, is hiding behind the sun, which that is a symbol of death and resurrection, by the way, because the planet goes behind the sun where you can't see it, and then when it pops out from the sun, that's the rebirth, that's the resurrection, right? But the sun and Jupiter and Regulus are in conjunction during a heliacal rising in Leo. Is that what he told them to look for? Because that would all fit with Matthew chapter 2. We have seen his star in the rising, right? His star being Tzedek, the planet Jupiter, right? But in conjunction with Regulus and the sun in a heliacal rising. I think that's what it is. I think that's a fair understanding of what happened. Could have been something else, possibly. Is there more to learn? Likely, right? But is that a reasonable explanation? I think that's a very reasonable explanation of what it was the Magi saw that kicked off them paying even more attention, and that over the next year, they saw a highly condensed series of events involving Jupiter and Regulus in Leo over the next year. So that really wasn't where I intended to go tonight, but we went there anyway, so that's okay. As I sign off here, let's take just 1 minute to remind you that we really appreciate you listening to God Save the King on the Truth Be Told Radio Network every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern. There's lots of great ways that you can listen to TBTRN. You can, of course, go to their website and click on the big listen button. There are a variety of apps that you can use: the Android app, MyTuner app, Wi-Fi radio, TuneIn radio, and of course, Alexa, Google, and Apple home devices can be used to listen to the show as well. We are on some great podcast platforms now. We are on Amazon, we are on Audible, we are on Spotify, we're on Google, and we are thrilled about that. So please catch God Save the King on the Truth Be Told Radio Network and the other great shows on the Truth Be Told Radio Network as well. And last but not least, if you're low tech, use your phone, dial in 641-741-2866 or 717-567-4977 to listen to the Truth Be Told Radio Network. So thank you for joining us. My name is Tim Kais, signing off. God save the King.